Well, a recent and rather inconspicuous Qantas flight from Sydney to Melbourne turned into a rather bemusing journey for Bella Debrera, all from reading the in-flight magazine. There was this article inside that began with a seemingly good food review, but turned into a kind of woke nonsense we do not tolerate on this show. I'm now joined by the very talented Bella Debrera from The Spectator Australia. How are you, Bella? Great to see you.
I'm very well, thank you, Rowan. Wonderful to be on your show.
Well, it's good to have you here. Now, let's tell us about this restaurant. And you saw this restaurant, and initially you were filled with excitement at the delicious and appetising-looking courses that were there, but then you read on and you discovered Marxism on the menu. Explain this to us, Bella Debrera.
Oh, look, Rowan, it's so disappointing. You know, I was reading through the Qantas magazine, trying to find something that wasn't woke, which is almost impossible at Qantas. But I thought one area which is going to be okay will be the restaurant reviews. Surely there'll be something that is just free of sustainability, free of wokeness. And I chanced upon a review about, it's called Big Esso. It's a Torres Strait Islander restaurant in Melbourne, in Federation Square. And I read through the menu and it sounded fantastic. And I thought, I'll look this up when I land. And I went to their website and was reading through the menu. And you have things like charred emu and spatchcock and all sorts of indigenous ingredients I've never heard of. And I thought I'd quite like to go there. But unfortunately, on further investigation, I read that they would only source products from queer-led Indigenous or women producers. And there was a very firmly written welcome to country and a very, very, very firmly written this country, you know, sovereignty was never ceded on the website. And of course, that immediately put me off. And I wondered where this came from, and I looked into it, and it's a thing called food justice, and it's called post-colonial food politics. And of course, no guesses as to where this comes from. It comes straight out of our university humanities departments. It's a post-colonial, post-modernist, Marxist madness that is now, you know, on our plates. And I'm really tired of it. So I thought, I'm going to write an article for the Specky.
Good. Well, I'm glad you did, because you asked some very pertinent and relevant questions. I mean, you do point out, does this mean that if you did go to the restaurant, you would have to ask the chef, does this mean that berries sourced by a queer Indigenous woman taste better than those sourced from a queer Indigenous man? For example, because if you play the identity politics game, there's this hierarchy and you've got to sit there somewhere on the hierarchy. Now, it's a pretty... Drilling down into this deeper, Bella, you're actually getting to the point where you're going to say that I'm not going to get this sort of food or that sort of food unless it comes from a particular person of a particular race and so on. Isn't this just racism?
It is racism, but I think actually, Rowan, it's more than that. You know, people talk about this woke movement, and I think woke is the wrong name for it. It doesn't really summarize how profoundly destructive it is. But there's more than that. There's sort of religious elements. You know, people talk about wokeism as a sort of secular religion, and this obsession with finding out where the food comes from and if it's pure, if it's been prepared by the right people, and only then can you sort of eat the food and feel wholly enjoying it, because it hasn't come from a dead white, it hasn't come from a boring white heterosexual male. It's come from one of the minority groups. It's come from one of the victim groups, the sort of the holy groups. So I think it's more than racism, and I think it sets I know it seems to be like a minor thing talking about a restaurant and where they get their food from, but you know, what kind of precedent does this set for other restaurants if one restaurant is doing this? Are they going to feel obliged, like this crazy pronoun thing where you have to, if you don't put your pronouns on, you're obviously not an ally? Is this going to be a new challenge for restaurants in across the West if they don't subscribe to this new fashion of saying where the food comes from? I think it's quite worrying.
You're right to stop, try and nip this stuff in the bud, because everything that you've always alerted us to has always just got worse and worse. You mentioned in the article also musicians and how a study of classical musicians found, or classical performers found, 0.1% of them were not white males or something like this. Tell us about that, and how therefore all classical music is racist, is colonial. Tell us about that.
Well, that's right. This is part of the same movement. It's this decolonization movement. So everything in the West has to be pulled down and destroyed. And of course, classical music is a prime target. I mean, you can't get more Western civilization than an orchestra. And there's been a movement for a while that has looked not only at the music that's being played, but also the composition of orchestras. And there's a general sort of agreement amongst the very woke left that you have to make sure that there's no white men in the orchestra, and that there are more women, or there are more coloured women, or there are more gay men, and there are more Indigenous gay men. You know, I mean, it goes down into this crazy intersectionality rabbit hole. But this particular report that I talked about was put together at, thankfully, not at Australians' taxpayers' expense this time, but English taxpayers, whose money was spent on looking at 111 orchestras across the world, including a number of Australian orchestras, to see the composition of the music that was being played. And they discovered, shock horror, that the classical music that was composed in the 18th century, in the 19th century, in the 17th century, was largely composed by white men, and most of them were dead.
The horror!
I mean, this is what they're spending their time. And there was 0.1% of composers was non-binary. I mean, I don't know how they worked that out from the music composed in the 18th century. But this is the madness. But people are taking this stuff seriously. This is a government-funded report. And this is the problem, that institutions are buying into this. And I still stand by the fact that most people don't want this. You don't want to go to a restaurant and be preached to. You don't want to be made to feel bad because you're on stolen land. You don't want to go to an orchestra and be worrying about, what is the sexual orientation of the composer, and why are they playing Mozart and Beethoven and not an Indigenous composer of the last 20 years. And, it's ruining the arts. It's ruining our life. They're absolute killjoys. And I'm sure your viewers can sort of appreciate the anguish that I went through reading a restaurant review and then finding out that they're serving up Marxism on updates in Melbourne.
Bella de Brera, always great to chat to you. Thank you so much. And you can read Bella's article. It's the cover story in this week's Spectator Australia. Thanks so much for your time.